There's a specific quality some people carry into difficult relationships, one that doesn't announce itself loudly, but becomes unmistakable over time. It's a kind of grounded steadiness that seems to make them almost immune to the usual tactics that work so reliably on everyone else. If you've ever watched someone navigate a narcissist with genuine ease, so unbothered by provocations that would send most people spiraling, unmoved by guilt trips that would ordinarily produce instant compliance, you've likely wondered what exactly they're doing differently, and whether that same steadiness might actually be available to you too. This is what we're exploring today, and I want to frame it precisely because authentic here means something specific, worth distinguishing from simple confidence or simple assertiveness. Authenticity, in the context we're examining, refers to a genuine, internally generated sense of identity. It's one that doesn't depend on external approval, external validation, or the accuracy of anyone else's opinion in order to feel stable and complete. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why this particular quality, more than any specific tactic or technique, functions as the most reliable protection available against narcissistic manipulation, and what it actually takes to develop it if you don't already possess it in full. Let's start with understanding why authenticity specifically neutralizes so much of what makes narcissistic manipulation effective in the first place. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how these tactics actually work. Guilt exploiting your genuine desire to be a good, considerate person, fast trust exploiting your genuine openness to connection, difficulty tolerating disappointment, exploiting your genuine care for others' feelings. Every single one of these tactics, examined closely, depends on a specific vulnerability worth naming directly: uncertainty about your own worth, your own judgment, or your own right to prioritize your own needs. It's uncertainty that manipulation can locate and exploit precisely because it's already present, waiting to be activated. Here's what's worth understanding about authentic people specifically, and why this particular vulnerability tends to be considerably smaller or entirely absent in them. Someone with a genuinely stable, internally generated sense of identity doesn't need external confirmation of their worth in order to feel secure in it. This means the entire mechanism most manipulation tactics depend on: creating doubt, creating uncertainty, creating a gap that manipulation can then fill with false reassurance or false accusation, simply doesn't find the same purchase it would in someone whose sense of self depends more heavily on external validation. The manipulation isn't necessarily attempted any less often. It just consistently fails to produce its intended effect, because the specific uncertainty it's designed to exploit isn't genuinely present to exploit in the first place. Let's talk about what this looks like in practice, because it's worth grounding in specific, observable behavior rather than leaving it abstract. Authentic people tend to respond to guilt-based manipulation with a specific quality worth naming: precisely genuine, unforced calm rather than performed indifference. When guilt gets deployed, you never think about anyone but yourself. "I can't believe you'd do this to me." An authentic person's internal response tends to involve a quick, almost automatic check against their own actual values and actual behavior, rather than an immediate, reflexive assumption that the accusation must be accurate simply because someone stated it with enough emotional force. This check happens quickly, often without much conscious deliberation, precisely because their relationship with their own values is already stable and clear enough that comparing an accusation against it doesn't require extensive internal negotiation. This is worth understanding as genuinely different from simply ignoring guilt or refusing to ever consider legitimate feedback, which would be its own kind of rigidity rather than genuine authenticity. Authentic people remain genuinely open to legitimate criticism, genuinely willing to examine their own behavior when something actually warrants examination. What differs is the speed and ease which they can distinguish legitimate feedback from manipulative guilt, precisely because their own internal values remain clear and accessible enough to serve as a genuine, reliable reference point, rather than being obscured by chronic uncertainty about their own worth or their own right to hold boundaries. Let's talk about a second observable pattern, one that connects to something we've traced throughout other explorations in this series, but manifests distinctly in authentic people specifically. A genuine comfort with disappointing others when disappointing them is actually the correct, necessary choice. This is worth understanding as considerably different from simple indifference to other people's feelings, which isn't authenticity at all, but rather a kind of coldness that authentic people, with their genuinely stable capacity for connection, typically don't display. So what authentic people display instead is something more precise. It's the ability to hold genuine care for someone's feelings alongside genuine willingness to disappoint them, when disappointing them is actually what integrity requires, without needing these two things to remain in conflict, or without needing the disappointment to resolve immediately through capitulation. This is worth understanding as one of the most protective qualities available against narcissistic manipulation specifically, because so much of this manipulation depends precisely on your discomfort with someone else's disappointment, using that discomfort as leverage to produce compliance you wouldn't otherwise offer. Someone who has made genuine peace with occasionally, necessarily disappointing others removes this leverage almost entirely, not through coldness, but through a kind of settled acceptance that disappointing someone, when it's genuinely warranted, doesn't actually threaten their own worth or their own fundamental goodness as a person. What we haven't yet explored is how authentic people specifically handle the more sophisticated, more emotionally charged tactics we've traced throughout this entire series: manufactured vulnerability, retroactive idealization, the deeper, more difficult to resist manipulations that go beyond simple guilt, and what actually needs to develop internally in order to build this same quality of authenticity, if it doesn't already come naturally, which is exactly where we need to go next. Let's talk about how authentic people specifically handle the more sophisticated tactics we've traced throughout this entire series, because these deserve separate attention, given how much more emotionally compelling they tend to be than straightforward guilt or simple criticism. Here's what's worth understanding about how authentic people navigate manufactured vulnerability: the sudden, seemingly genuine confessions of childhood pain or deep insecurity we discussed extensively in an earlier exploration throughout this series. Authentic people tend to hold something specific and important: the ability to feel genuine compassion for someone's pain, while simultaneously maintaining complete clarity that compassion doesn't obligate them to abandon their own boundaries or their own assessment of the actual situation. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth understanding why it's so much harder for people without this same internal stability to maintain. When your own sense of worth depends partly on being seen as compassionate, as understanding, as the kind of person who doesn't abandon someone in visible pain, manufactured vulnerability exploits exactly this dependency, making withdrawal or boundary holding feel like evidence of your own moral failure rather than simply an accurate, reasonable response to the actual pattern you're observing. Authentic people don't experience this same conflict nearly as intensely, precisely because their sense of being a genuinely good, compassionate person doesn't depend on proving it through every single interaction, particularly not through interactions where genuine compassion has been repeatedly weaponized against their own well-being. They can genuinely feel for someone's pain, and separately, clearly, without internal conflict, decide that their own boundary remains the correct choice regardless of that pain, because their identity as a caring person was never actually contingent on this specific interaction proving it once again. Let's talk about retroactive idealization, the sudden, intense reconstruction of a relationship's history that often surfaces once genuine detachment threatens to become permanent. Authentic people tend to navigate this particular tactic with a specific quality worth naming directly: reliance on their own accumulated, contemporaneous understanding of what actually happened, rather than allowing a compellingly delivered, retrospective narrative to override what they directly experienced and understood at the time. This connects to something we've traced throughout other explorations in this series regarding maintaining private, honest records, but for authentic people, this reliable record often exists more naturally, internally, because their relationship with their own perception was never significantly damaged in the first place. It's meaning they don't require the same external documentation many survivors of these dynamics genuinely need in order to maintain confidence in their own accurate memory. This is worth understanding as revealing something important about the actual, underlying difference between authentic people and people currently working to rebuild authenticity after damage has already occurred. It isn't that authentic people are simply immune to compelling, retrospective narratives through some innate superiority. It's that their baseline trust in their own perception was never significantly eroded, which means retroactive idealization, however emotionally compelling, simply doesn't have the same foothold it would have in someone whose self-trust has already been weakened through sustained exposure to exactly this kind of narrative manipulation. So now let's talk about what actually needs to develop internally in order to build this same quality of authenticity, if it doesn't already come naturally, because this is genuinely the most important, most practical question this exploration can address. Here's the first requirement worth understanding precisely: a clear, deliberately articulated understanding of your own actual values, distinct from other people's expectations of you, distinct from whatever role you've historically been expected to play in your relationships. This might sound abstract, but it's worth making concrete, because vague, unexamined values are considerably easier to manipulate than clearly articulated ones. If you've never actually sat down and honestly identified what you actually believe about honesty, about boundaries, about your own right to prioritize your own well-being, you're considerably more vulnerable to having someone else's confidently stated version of these values substituted for your own in moments of genuine pressure. Let's talk about the second requirement, one that connects directly to something we've traced throughout many other explorations in this entire series: deliberate, repeated practice tolerating other people's disappointment without immediately working to resolve it. This is worth understanding as genuinely uncomfortable, especially at first, precisely because it requires directly confronting exactly the discomfort manipulation has always depended on you avoiding. Authentic people weren't born with an innate ability to tolerate this discomfort. In most cases, this capacity was built gradually through repeated practice, disappointing someone in a low-stakes situation, noticing that the relationship survived, that your own sense of worth remained intact, and slowly, through accumulated evidence, developing genuine confidence that disappointment, when it's genuinely warranted, doesn't actually threaten anything essential about who you are. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to address the third and most foundational requirement for developing genuine authenticity. Why this specific quality ultimately matters, more than any specific tactic or technique this entire series has traced throughout its full length, and what it actually looks like to build a life organized around this kind of authentic, internally generated stability going forward. So let's talk about the third and most foundational requirement for developing genuine authenticity, because it ties together everything we've traced throughout this exploration into its deepest, most complete forms. Genuine, ongoing practice distinguishing your own authentic reactions from reactions you've been conditioned to perform, particularly in moments of genuine pressure, when the conditioned response tends to surface fastest and feel most automatic. Here's what's worth understanding about why this specific distinction matters so much. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how years of navigating narcissistic relationships tend to produce automatic, conditioned responses: reflexive apology, reflexive explanation, reflexive accommodation, responses that happen quickly, before conscious thought has a chance to intervene, precisely because they were built through years of repetition. It's reinforced by an environment that consistently rewarded exactly this kind of automatic compliance. Building genuine authenticity requires learning to recognize this specific gap, so the difference between what you actually, authentically feel and believe in a given moment, and what you've simply been conditioned to produce automatically, regardless of what your genuine internal experience actually is. This is worth understanding as requiring genuine, deliberate practice, because the gap between authentic reaction and conditioned response often isn't obvious in the moment itself. It requires developing a habit of pausing, even briefly, to genuinely ask yourself what you actually think and feel, separate from what you've historically been expected to produce in situations like this one. Over time, with enough repeated practice, this pause becomes shorter, more automatic, until the authentic response itself becomes the default, rather than something requiring deliberate, effortful excavation underneath layers of conditioned reflexes. Let's talk about why this specific quality, authenticity built through these three requirements, matters considerably more than any specific tactic or technique this entire series has traced throughout its full length. Remember everything we've discussed across dozens of explorations, specific responses to specific manipulation tactics, specific boundaries for specific situations, specific understanding of specific psychological mechanisms. All of this knowledge remains genuinely valuable, worth keeping and applying as needed. But knowledge and technique, however sophisticated, still require conscious, effortful application in the moment, still require you to correctly identify which tactic is currently being deployed and correctly recall which specific response this entire series has recommended for it. Authenticity operates considerably differently, and considerably more efficiently, because it doesn't require this same conscious, effortful matching of tactic to technique. It simply produces the correct response naturally, because that response flows directly from a stable, clear sense of your own values and your own worth, rather than from remembered instruction applied in real time under pressure. This is worth understanding as the actual, deepest reason authentic people seem to handle narcissists with such apparent ease, an ease that can look, from the outside, almost effortless, almost intuitive. It isn't that they've simply memorized more effective techniques than everyone else. It's that they're not actually relying on technique at all, in the way someone still building this capacity necessarily has to. They're relying on something considerably more fundamental: a genuine, settled relationship with their own identity, one that automatically, reflexively resists exactly the kind of manipulation this entire series has spent so much time helping you recognize and understand, simply because that manipulation has nothing genuinely uncertain left to work with. Here's the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration. It's one that connects this specific topic to something considerably larger this entire series has been building toward throughout its full length. Every single technique, every single boundary, every single piece of psychological understanding we've traced across this entire series was never actually meant to remain permanently necessary, consciously applied, effortfully remembered in every difficult moment for the rest of your life. It was always meant to function as scaffolding, supporting you while the actual, deeper work happened underneath it, the slow, patient construction of genuine authenticity, a stable, internally generated sense of who you are, clear enough and secure enough that manipulation eventually finds considerably less to work with. It's not because you've memorized more sophisticated defenses, but because you've become, gradually and genuinely, someone whose worth no longer requires anyone else's confirmation in order to feel entirely, permanently real. So if there's one thing worth carrying forward from this entire exploration, and genuinely from everything this entire series has traced throughout its full and considerable length, let it be this. You were never actually meant to become an expert in narcissistic tactics, forever vigilant, forever applying carefully remembered techniques in every difficult interaction for the rest of your life. You were meant to use everything this understanding offered as a bridge toward something considerably more valuable and considerably more permanent, becoming someone who's authentic. Settled sense of self simply doesn't require the same techniques anymore, because the uncertainty they once depended on has finally, genuinely, been replaced by something no manipulation, however sophisticated, however emotionally compelling, can actually reach.